Limbo was released initially in 2010 on the Xbox 360 as part of the Xbox Live Arcade, similar to games like Fez and Super Meat Boy, just to name some of the more notable ones. Of course, if you've played Limbo more recently, you would have likely played it on Steam or Switch. The reason why I started this video by mentioning when Limbo was released is because Flash games like The Impossible Quiz, The Impossible Game, and The World's Hardest Game were released around that time too, between 2008 and 2010. Why is this important? What do these games have in common, and why is it interesting? Well, that's what this video is about. Hopefully you enjoy. Firstly, I'm going to now play a clip from The Impossible Quiz. Now, I'm going to play a clip from Limbo. Both games have these things in common. They both have puzzles, and these puzzles can be illogical, resulting in the player needing to use trial and error in order to solve them. The consequences for failure in both titles is death and forced repetition. Now, this is a very common design practice and still is to some extent in what people call nowadays rage games, such as Will You Snail or VVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVVV set to overcome, so the player has to essentially guess initially. The progression the player feels throughout playing games like Will You Snail or the Impossible Game or the Impossible Quiz is they accrued knowledge of these answers to these puzzles over time. Rage games are essentially memory games for players aged 25 or below. But Limbo isn't a rage game, so why does it have so many similar characteristics? Well, let's take a look at the positives of this design decision, how Limbo tweaks them, and why it's so beneficial to the overall design. Firstly, the main positive is that there is really no better consequence for motivating the player to understand and retain information than death. In a game like Portal, you could be very much stuck in the same room for 5 or 10 minutes, just scratching your head with no state change. In The Witness, very much the same thing, you could be staring at a set of screens for even longer, and other than the feeling of wanting to protect yourself from boredom or frustration, there is no pressure to solve these puzzles. In Limbo, the player is conditioned very early on, where if they make a mistake or do a puzzle wrong, they die and start again. So that's the benefit, the fact that there's no real better motivator than the consequence that's in Limbo and rage games. But what's the potential negative for the design, and how does Limbo soften that negative? So if we take a look at flow theory, the theory of how players can stay in the flow state of playing a game and not get too frustrated or too bored, looking at a graph where one axis is frustration and the other axis is boredom, it's relatively intuitive to consider that this level of binary consequence and lack of information could force players to be further and further up the frustration progression path as they play through the game, especially on repeated failures. The 3 ways that Limbo reduces this frustration that the other games I have mentioned do not are: number 1, rapid restart. Now this could be even quicker if it was a modern title, but the average time to retry a puzzle is less than 5 seconds. Comparing it to the Impossible Quiz, if you're on question 20 for example, then it could be 10 or more seconds depending on how quick you are at getting back to that question. Number 2, compartmentalized memorization. Unlike games like Will You Snail or the Impossible Game, the player does not have to remember potentially hundreds of moves in sequence. Instead, in Limbo there's usually a maximum of 3 different puzzles to remember before reaching a checkpoint, and that's the absolute maximum. This plays into the rapid restart point, but is big for de-risking loss of retention in the player. And then finally, number 3, the game, I think, is purposefully designed so that the player sits a few increments below the line of the flow graph as they move from one area to another. So they are actually already a bit closer to boredom than they maybe should be. Areas between puzzles are designed purposely to sell the ambience and the world that the game is set in, so when the player comes across a challenge, they have essentially some wiggle room before they get too frustrated. And these are all incredibly important things to understand and consider when it comes to Limbo's design. Arndt Jensen, the creator of Limbo, over the years has clearly stated that the design philosophy of the game was to create an emotionally evocative experience. Those emotions that they wanted to evoke were mystery and unease. Also, regardless of knowing the intentions of the creator, the perception of the game is one of art and narrative. So to boil down the design of Limbo, I would say this: the design intention was to create a wordless narrative experience that evokes mystery and unease, which is done via the art of the game, but also the design. The puzzles are designed so that the player lacks key information, both making them feel uneasy and curious to undiscover how they work. Now, this design does inherit the frustration found in this design method from other games in the rage game genre, for example, but by having a quick restart, less to remember, and less stimulating experiences between puzzles, it negates that negative. So there we are. This video was very much that I just wanted to talk about Limbo, really, and also unlock the memory of sneakily playing the Impossible Quiz whilst on a laptop in school. Hopefully you enjoyed this more talkative and less analytical type of video. If you did, please leave a like and let me know in the comments so that I know you want to see more of this stuff. Also, don't forget to subscribe to be notified when I release my next video, and keep on keeping on.